Secretary General, honourable national negotiating delegates, distinguished professors, doctors and fathers of science, acting Prime Minister. Yes, you, sir. My remarks as I open this presentation are directed at you, for you have described the 99.7% of scientists published in the peer-reviewed journals who do not even believe that more than 50% of recent global warming was man-made as a fringe minority of fanatics. Sir, 99.7% is a very large majority. It is you, sir, who are the fanatic, and I therefore call upon you to resign your office forthwith. Turning to the science, Secretary General, I wish to make one simple point in this presentation, and that is that everything upon which this conference of the parties here in Madrid is predicated is in substance and in essence false. It is not true. As you have heard from Professor Gus Perkhout, there is no climate emergency. The climate is doing just fine. And you talk of saving the planet is not at risk. It was triumphantly saved 2,000 years ago, and it does not need to be saved again. So I'm going to put before you today, Secretary General and negotiating delegates, the moral case for principled inaction on climate change. Because I'm going to begin with the consequences of departing from the truth. In traditional theology, the difference between good and evil is coterminous and coextensive with and congruent with the difference between that which is true and that which is deliberately false. And the wages of sin, and particularly of that sin, that central sin of departure from the truth, is death. And the cult of climate change hysteria, which this conference is promoting, like the others before it, is the cult of death. And to wish for the death of the majority of humanity, as so many of you delegates do, is an unspeakable wickedness. You align yourself, Mr. Prime Minister and delegates, with the communists who waved their hated flag of tyranny, oppression, disease, poverty, and death for the first time since the Berlin Wall came down at the Copenhagen Climate Conference in 2009. You align yourselves with the communists who, just as they did in 1932, used a very similar logo in 2017 in USA, again on the climate issue. You align yourself with Fridays for Fascism and the other groups of goons and loons and thugs who are going around terrorizing harmless meetings of scientists, such as that splendid meeting organized 2 weeks ago, as you've just heard from Herr Wolfgang Müller of the Europäisches Institut für Klima und Energie. We do not want to see again in the first part of the 21st century the suppression of independent scientific thought, research and action that we saw in the first part of the 20th. And here, regrettably, is the Duke of Edinburgh. And here is what he said: I am tempted to ask for reincarnation as a particularly deadly virus so that he can kill humans. This strand in totalitarian thinking is rejected. And the excuse for it is a kind of Malthusian mania. Here is a true hockey stick graph. It's the population hockey stick. And there you will see there has been a very sharp increase in the human population thanks to increases in health and prosperity, but chiefly because of near universal access to electrical power. That has done more than anything else to lift the nations of the world out of poverty, disease, and death. We now have nearly 8 billion people on the planet, and those X's there are those parts of the planet which are more or less wholly exempt from any obligations under the Paris Climate Treaty. The global population is now going to rise a bit faster than it would have done over the last 10 years in the original figures. It won't reach the Verhulst asymptote until 2100. It was going to reach it in 2050. Why is the population growing faster than we had thought it was going to, despite the falling population growth rate? Despite the ever-lengthening mean age of first childbirth, despite the falling global fertility rate. The reason is that poverty causes higher birth rates. Births per woman in the poor countries, chiefly in sub-Saharan Africa that you see here, are far higher than they are in the 20 rich countries you see here. These are rich countries that do not also suffer from mass net immigration. And that's where births per woman have fallen the fastest. And yet, the population of the world is rising faster than we had planned for. And the reason for that is that 1.2 billion people are denied access to domestic electricity. And so why are they denied it? They are denied it because global warming is said to be a problem. So let us first of all see how much money has been spent and what has been achieved for the spending. Well, trillions have now been spent. Trillions more are planned to be spent. The Green New Deal in America alone, they're going to spend $18.5 trillion in the next 10 years. Where they're going to get this money from, they haven't quite said, but that's what they're planning to spend. But here is what the trillions spent so far have achieved. You will see that coal remains one of the dominant sources of power. There's oil, there's gas, the three fossil fuels, as they're called. Nuclear and hydro, very small. So-called renewables, practically invisible on the graph. And you'll see that the increases in primary energy growth, just in 2018, you get up-to-date figures at this conference. You'll see there that very nearly all of them, in fact 70% of those contributions to primary energy growth in 2018 come from nations which are wholly exempt from any obligation under the Paris Treaty. And therefore, delegates, everything you do at this conference, which may have the effect of making the West poorer, will not make these countries richer. It will not give them the electricity they so desperately need. It will not lift them out of poverty, and therefore it will not allow us to stabilize the global population. Here is the share of global electricity generation by fuel. And as you'll see, in 1986, before the global warming hysteria even began to get its boots on, it was 38%. And now, after 25 years of these wearisome conferences to which you delegates like to come on your jets with your huge carbon footprint, haven't you yet learnt that you can do this by video conferencing and save yourselves the carbon footprint and set an example? Because if you preach to us without practicing what you preach, we're not going to pay any attention to you. Here it is. After 25 years of these conferences, King Coal, the thing that you hate most, has now actually gone up. It's 38.5% of total global electricity generation by fuel. All your conferences have achieved nothing. And here is coal consumption by region. And when you see the words Asia Pacific, that is a code word for China and occupied Tibet. They are the chief reason why coal consumption worldwide is going up. But Mr. Obama went to Peking and talked to Mr. Xi Jinping in 2015 before the Paris Climate Conference and said to him, look, we're all communists together. I'm going to exempt you from any obligations under Paris if only you will agree to let this treaty, which will ruin the West and make China richer, because all the businesses in the West will have to close down, the motor manufacturing, the aluminium smelters, the steel works, they're all going to go. And now we're going to go for meat as well, so all the farming will go. It'll all be transferred to China. You're going to become the richest country on earth, and you'll be persuading the West to bankrupt itself in the name of global warming. And you can see how well this is working out. That's coal consumption by region. That vast yellow area there, that is the Asia Pacific, which is chiefly China and occupied Tibet. And of course, with all these subsidies to these electric batteries, which are so much less efficient than real cars, lithium carbonate prices from the mines run by slave children in China and places like that, they have quintupled over the last few years. So no longer is electric cars, even with subsidies, going to become a cheap option. And now let's have a quick look at the science upon which you delegates have been relying without having bothered ever to check it. Here again is a measure of your spectacular failure. The CO2 concentration in the atmosphere is rising faster than IPCC's business as usual scenario in 1990. There it is from the authoritative annual report produced in 2018 by Corinne Lecquerre et al. There it is. It's above the business as usual, do nothing about the climate at all level. So that is how little your conferences have achieved for all these trillions spent. And as Mr. Taylor in his distinguished presentation said earlier, you predicted, or you're the scientists you like to listen to, this tiny minority, predicted in 1990 that there would be 1/3 of a Celsius per decade of global warming. And it hasn't happened. And now the very latest predictions is if you double the CO2 in the atmosphere, this is what the models show, 4.1 Celsius of global warming per doubling of CO2. All of these figures, I can assure you, have been plucked out of the air, unlike the CO2, which, as you see, has not been plucked out of the air. So why has there been so much less global warming than was predicted? There you see the credibility gap between what their own numbers for radiative forcing and radiative imbalance and global warming would have led them to expect. That's in the orange cursor on the left there and the purple cursor on the right there, current predictions. There is a huge gap between the two. They are predicting 3 times as much warming as is actually happening. And here you can actually calculate from their own data for the warming from 1850 to 2011, for the radiative forcing that represents that warming, for the radiative imbalance that represents the warming they imagined would come through, which hasn't yet come through. You would expect to get less than 1.4 Celsius per doubling of CO2, not 4.1. It's a simple equation. You can do it on the back of an envelope. But you haven't done it. That's why you're all here talking about saving the planet. And here's another of the mistakes that you made. You forgot in your calculations, you scientists, that the sun is shining. You have assigned all the feedback response to the direct warming caused by CO2 and other greenhouse gases. You've ascribed all the feedback response to the greenhouse gases. You haven't realized that the fact that the sun is shining, even if there weren't any greenhouse gases, would also induce a feedback response. You have left it out of your calculations. And the result of leaving it out of the calculations is that you have hugely exaggerated the final CO2 warming that you might get. And so what is missing in your calculation, what's missing is that feedback response to that part of the temperature caused by the fact that the sun is shining that would give us a temperature above freezing across the planet, about 207 Kelvin. Everything above that is going to produce a feedback response, and quite a large one. And if you include that in the calculation, then, and you assume that that feedback response will be as much per Kelvin of the feedback active part of the sunshine as the greenhouse gases would generate, 1.5 Celsius of warming per CO2 doubling, much the same as Lewis and Carey calculated by a completely different method. If we assume, even if we assume that the feedback response to the greenhouse gases is 4 times that you had from the sunshine, it's still only going to go up to 2.2 Celsius of warming per doubling of CO2. Even that isn't enough to cause a crisis, an emergency, a Thermageddon, call it what you like with your ever more hyperbolic language. None of this makes any scientific sense whatever. And if you assume that the greenhouse gases have even more of a multiplier effect, it just gets sillier and sillier to see how much warming you produce. None of it works. The fact is 2.2 is the absolute, beyond the maximum warming that you could possibly get per doubling of CO2. And even that is half of what they say it would be. And here's another little conundrum you might like to start thinking about. If you look at how quickly the ratio of, sorry, we get this back, the ratio of the unit feedback response to the greenhouse gases, to the unit feedback response, to the fact that the sun is shining, you see that that rises very, very rapidly with predictions across the top there of how much warming you're going to get per doubling of CO2. It just gets sillier and sillier more and more rapidly. Now, today's temperature is about 288 Kelvin, and that's about plus 14 Celsius. Now, they say that without greenhouse gases, except a bit of water vapor to keep the clouds that are there today, that would come down to 255 Kelvin. They call that the emission temperature. You can see there how it is calculated. But in calculating that emission temperature, they're not only forgetting the sun is shining, they're forgetting the sun only shines on one half of the globe. You'll see that factor 4 in yellow there. That is because the ratio of the Earth's great circle, which receives the sunlight, the ratio of the spherical surface area of the Earth to that great circle is 4. But of course, the sunlight only falls on the day side. That ratio should only be 2. And if you do that correctly, let's do it for the moon, first of all. You can see you get a profile of temperatures. It's going to be hottest at the subsolar point on the left, and the bigger the solar zenith angle as you go towards the terminator, the edge of the moon that we see from here when the sun's shining on it, then the temperatures decline. And we can show this. If you look on the right there, you can see that's an image from the Lunar Diviner satellite that measures the temperature of the moon. It's obviously hottest at the direct subsolar point, and it gets cooler towards the terminators. And you can see it gets cooler roughly in accordance with the cosine of the solar zenith angle, as is demonstrated on the left there. So if we simply use that cosine of the solar zenith angle, we can calculate, as we have done there with the green curve, exactly how much warming we would expect would happen on the dayside surface of the moon. They sent up a $1 billion satellite to do this. They could have come to me and I would have calculated it on my pocket calculator and charged them only $500 million. And today's Earth dayside temperature, about 292.5 Kelvin. But if you integrate that green curve I've just shown you, that gives you a dayside temperature of 289 Kelvin. So instead of the 32 Celsius of greenhouse effect, or 33 that we were looking at, that you delegates imagine, you see it might only be about 3 Kelvin. And that's before we really start doing a little bit of calculation, because, of course, the Earth, unlike the moon, has an atmosphere. And what does that atmosphere do? What does the climate do? It is an engine for transferring heat away from the subsolar point and towards the poles. And if you take a realistic view of how much of that heat you transfer towards the poles, the same amount of radiation can come in, but if you move the heat, the radiation towards the poles, the temperature of the whole Earth goes up even though there's no more radiation coming in. Not many climate scientists know that, but it does. If you take that into account, and I've done a few calculations here, then you end up by seeing that, first of all, you get about 300 Kelvin, that's the middle red figure there, before you then deduct the amount of radiation which is absorbed partly by the atmosphere, mostly by the ground. And that brings the temperature back down again to 292.5 Kelvin. And that is today's temperature, mean dayside temperature. And yet, in all of this calculation, we have not at any point considered any warming effect at all from CO2. Now, these figures will need refinement. We're still working on this. We still think there is a greenhouse effect, but it is evidently very, very much smaller than is currently imagined. And that is why I can endorse the distinguished contribution to this conference by Professor Happer earlier, who said that you're looking at around 1 Celsius per doubling of CO2 concentration. You take the feedback foobar and the error they've made with emission temperature. You take those two things together, and you get really quite a small amount of warming. But now there's a new war on the horizon that these people are driving. It's the war on meat. In 1984, they said that eating bacon would give you cholesterol problems. In 1999, they began to realize that, as usual, the extremists were wrong and that cholesterol is actually good for you, including the so-called bad cholesterol. If you're over 65 like me, high cholesterol is actually better for you than low. But in 2015, now we have the war on meat yet again. And you see Time magazine, which always just follows fashion. It is not a leader of opinion, it's a follower, it's a mirror. And you'll see now the war on meat is starting up, and it's going to be a big one. And what it's going to do is kill lots of people. It's going to kill 425 million adults worldwide who are currently suffering from diabetes. On average, most of those will have type 2 diabetes. And here are just the figures for one country, the United States of America. In 1977, there was a locked doors conference of the National Institutes of Health, which had been captured at the time by communists, and they wouldn't allow any of the stakeholders in nutrition who had been invited to that conference to leave that locked room until they had signed a pre-drafted consensus statement on what the American public should be recommended to eat. At that time, the prevalence of diabetes and all its associated complications, obesity, dementia, heart attacks, and eye disease and limbs dropping off, it's a catastrophic disease, this, was 1 or 2%. Within 2 years of the introduction of the guidelines that had been enforced in this way, that had begun to climb, and now something like $2 health in 3 in the United States arise from the recommendation in the official guidelines on what to eat, that you should eat carbohydrates and you shouldn't eat meat, or you should eat much less of it. We evolved 2 million years ago eating meat. We ate meat for 2 million years. We are designed to eat meat. Fat is good for you. It doesn't clog your arteries, or at least it's eating too much carbohydrates that causes it to do that. So diabetes now is also affecting China and occupied Tibet. There you can see the trend in China. That follows the trend in the United States. And you can see that globally there's going to be a huge explosion in diabetes. This probably underestimates the scale of the future problem, because more and more countries, because global warming, are recommending that to save the planet, we mustn't eat meat. Well, if you don't eat meat, diabetes, it's going to be about double that in 2040 if everybody stops eating meat, because if you don't eat meat, you have to eat carbohydrates, so you won't get enough energy. These are the officially imagined diabetes risk factors, the things that cause diabetes from the International Diabetes Federation. They do not even list the only significant cause of type 2 diabetes, that's the 90% of all diabetes, which is excess consumption of carbohydrates. The United States recommends that carbohydrates should be the staple in your diet, 60% of your diet. No, it shouldn't. That's why you have obesity and diabetes in the United States. And we introduced the same guidelines, again, under a socialist government, exactly 16 years later. And again, our prevalence of diabetes was 2% at that time, obesity 2%. Now we are on the same rising curve as the United States, but displaced by those 16 years, because people tend to follow these government guidelines to a much greater degree than you might imagine. And these government guidelines are killing people. And you, delegates at this United Nations conference, are proposing to issue instructions that people should eat less meat. Those instructions are nothing short of genocidal, and I call upon you to withdraw them forthwith. Here is why carbohydrates are dangerous: because they are converted to sugar very, very rapidly in the body within half an hour of ingestion. So you get a huge spike in glucose in the blood, which then the pancreas has to produce enough insulin to force the sugar into the fat cells, and eventually the pancreas gets tired of doing that and it fails. Proteins, you're going to get about 25% protein in whatever you eat. You don't need to worry about that. But even that produces something of a rise. But fats, which should be the mainstream of your diet, if you want to get thin, eat fat. There you will see that that has a very, very little response, and it's spread over 2 hours. That will do you no harm at all. So that's why your recommendation, delegates, that we should not be eating meat is extremely dangerous. And I call upon you to reverse it, and instead I encourage you to, this bull was actually named after me in Australia by the farmer who bred it. It's a prize-winning bull, as you would expect with my name on it. And so you can confidently eat meat, and you should do so. It is not bad for the environment. So these agents of genocide at this conference, I call upon you to rethink the consequences of your policies for human life, and not only just for the jobs in the industries that you are making us transfer to China and occupied Tibet. If you want to end poverty, the quickest way to do it is how you're going about it, to kill the poor. 1.3 billion people in the world do not have access to power, access to electrical power. It's defined by the International Energy Agency as just 50 to 100 kilowatt hours per year, enough to run just one 60-watt light bulb for only 4 hours a day. Not exactly a generous allocation. 1.3 billion people on the earth do not even have that. And lack of electricity is one of the world's biggest killers. In homes without mains electricity, there are 4.3 million deaths a year from particulate pollution in open cooking fires. That's the World Health Organization's figure. 500,000 women a year die in childbirth because of lack of access to electricity. In Europe, the life expectancy is 80 years. It's ablaze with light at the top of the graph there. In Africa, 65 years because they don't have electricity. That's the big difference. And light also goes to high IQ, as you will see here. So here are the agents of genocide. The World Bank, which as far back as 2010, because global warming, stopped lending to desperately needy developing countries for coal-fired power stations. And they won't even lend to them for oil and gas extraction after 2019, after this year, because global warming. Here is a list of just some of the major commercial and merchant and bureaucratic international banks who are now refusing to lend to desperate developing countries, to allow them to have the electricity that allows me to bring this presentation to those of you out there who are fortunate enough to have it. And then there's the environmental cost of environmentalism. Feeding cars and not people. Where's the sense in that? This has led to a doubling of world food prices in the last 10 or 15 years, and food riots in many countries of the world, hardly reported here at this conference, delegates. You don't want to know just how much trouble your policies are actually causing. And you have heard the profoundly moving speech from Douglas Pollock on how your policies have led to the surge in electricity prices in Chile, which eventually provoked the poor into saying, we can stand this no longer. And then, of course, the communists moved in and exploited their distress. So this is a crime against humanity. It's a crime against humanity. This is the words of Herr Jean Ziegler, the UN's own right to food rapporteur in 2007, to convert agricultural productive soil, which produces foodstuff, to be turned instead into biofuel. And then there are the windmills, which bat these birds and bats and bees out of the sky by the millions worldwide. The destructiveness per terawatt hour generated of so-called renewable energy is many times higher than that of the so-called fossil fuels. Here are some of the birds that get killed. And then you don't get any CO2 emissions abatement. As you've just heard from Wolfgang Müller, you have to keep the fossil-fueled power stations turning in case the wind stops blowing. And although most of you climate scientists haven't noticed this, the sun doesn't shine at night, so solar panel isn't going to work at night, however hard you try. And then we've already heard about the electrical cars that catch fire. But the big problem with electric cars is the weight of the batteries. It means you have to use 30% more energy to make them go than a real car. And the problem in doing that is that you reduce the efficiency of an electric car back to that of a real car as it was in the 1950s when I was born. And you delegates call that progress. Pull the other one, Squire, it's got bells on. Cold is the real killer, not warmth. And even the pietistic EU Commission, which had hoped to demonstrate that warmer weather, even if we had as much as 1 Kelvin per decade, 1 Celsius per decade of warming over the next 6 decades, they tried to show that this would cause a net loss of life in Europe. It doesn't. It saves a net 94,000 lives in Europe over the next 60 years, even if we get that extreme rate of warming, which is 10 times the realistic rate at which warming is actually happened or foreseeably will happen. And then there's the candy cane question, which you delegates have failed to ask. You failed to ask, how much global warming remission are we going to get for the trillions in taxpayers' money that we are spending? Now, there are rules for calculating this. You need to know what is the present value of the income stream over the next 40 years to your decarbonisation proposals. You have to know what the market discount rate is. It's at least 5%, more normally 7 or 8. But the figure you're using is 1.3%. That gives you an artificial estimate that you're in fact planning your results on the basis that there's a 10% chance of the world coming to an end by 2100. All of this is nonsense. And what's more, your totalitarianism, your imposing costs on the present generation means that we've got less wealth to hand on to the next generation, so they will suffer too from your policies. I'm not going to go through these calculations now, but broadly speaking, what it shows is that it's going to cost, even on the cheapest of all the proposals I can find, that's the United Kingdom's proposal for decarbonisation, they think they can do it, at a cost which works out as $273 trillion per Celsius of global warming abated. And these figures are just monstrous, that even that is 10 times the cost of letting the global warming happen and paying the cost of adapting to it. And the Green New Deal is somewhere between 100 and 1,000 times the cost of letting global warming happen and adapting to it. All of this is insane. So mitigation is unaffordable, not least because if CO2 residence time is only 125 years, as the IPCC says, very little mitigation can occur this century, whatever we do. You need to know these very simple facts. No policy to abate global warming by taxing, trading, regulating, reducing or replacing greenhouse gas emissions will prove cost-effective solely on grounds of the welfare benefit from climate mitigation. CO2 mitigation strategies that are inexpensive enough to be affordable will be ineffective, and strategies costly enough to be effective will be unaffordable. Focused adaptation is better if there's anything to adapt to, because as Professor Happer in his distinguished presentation made very clear, there is no scientific problem that needs to be addressed. Even if there were, the cost of the premium extravagantly exceeds the cost of the risk insured, so don't take out the insurance. Don't spend the taxpayers' money. Don't drive the poor people of Chile into rioting because they can't afford to travel by train. Climate concerns sprang from elementary errors of physics. After correction, there will be less than 1.5 degrees warming by 2100. Warming will be net beneficial. The cost of climate action exceeds any legitimately foreseeable benefit, and the morally correct and economically just and scientifically right policy is to have the courage to do nothing and to spend nothing. And I end by saying this. I understand that China wants to grow her economy, doesn't want to have to compete with the West for natural resources, therefore wants the West to do badly financially, wants the West to destroy its economies by global warming policy. That's what Xi Jinping wants. His predecessor honorably didn't want that, but he does. And he is subsidizing all manner of groups in the West who are promoting this nonsense. Putin has a different geopolitical motive. He wants to go on selling natural gas into Europe at anything up to 4 times the world price, with the unfortunate acquiescence of the ghastly unelected European Commission, who call themselves commissars. That's the official German name for them. So we have these very real large powers who are gaining advantage by fostering in the feeble-minded of the West and of the world the notion that there is a climate emergency that has not existed, does not exist, and will not exist. Therefore, I call upon this conference to bring itself as rapidly as possible to an end, and I declare that the conference that was to have been held in Glasgow next year is cancelled, and there will be no more COPs. That's it. We're over.
Thanks for watching this video. Please subscribe to our channel and consider donating to the Heartland Institute to support more vibrant free markets, greater individual liberties, and more videos like this one.